Thank you so much, Vera. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I must say a real honor for me to accept this appointment. For the years that I've been growing older and have worked in issues of aging, I've become more and more convinced that you can't know about people's lives unless you spend time in the settings where they live. So it is a great pleasure to be here, not the least of which it is minus 18 at home. So let me begin where it seems to me we all begin, or at least for me, marked the beginning. And that is with the people who were my grandmothers. In my eyes, they were always old, though when I look back, they were middle-aged when I was born. And I had the privilege of seeing them grow old. But in that self-centered manner of children and adolescents, I didn't pay any attention to aging. All I knew was that there were two old women in my life, one of whom I connected with very strongly and who really was my anchor, and one of whom was not very visible. And I think her invisibility had to do with her own place in her life, in her marriage, in the time at which she was born. And I'm going to divest myself of this because it is. My maternal grandmother was my grandfather's second wife. His first wife had 7 daughters and died when she was in her 30s, probably from having 7 children in 9 or 10 years. And I often wonder how a man with 7 daughters, little children, attracted another wife. But I guess I will never know the answer to that question. Nonetheless, my grandmother, whom you see here, and he married, she had 2 more girls, so there were 9 girls in my mother's family. My grandfather was a very harsh and domineering man. He made a lot of money in business. He lost a lot of money in business. He left the household, as men did in that generation, to his wife to raise these children and to support him. And I think I didn't know her because she was in the background. And I also didn't know her because I was one of 40 or more cousins, grandchildren, and we weren't really individuals in her life. So she was shadowy, and yet I look back with great admiration at what she must have done to support those children and her husband. My maternal grandmother raised 4 children, and her husband was mostly absent. He was an engineer. These were days in Canada when they were building large hydroelectric dams, and he was away most of the time. So she raised her 4 children very much on her own in a new community that was new to her. And apparently they were quite a challenge, particularly my father, at least the family folklore goes. Those of you who know me well know that his strong-minded independence was something he passed along to me. So she did all those things. She raised chickens, she grew a big garden, she educated those children. But most important to me, in the last year or so of her life, she talked to me about her life, about its transitions, about the things that were important to her, about the people she'd lost. And it was at that very time that I was doing a graduate program in developmental psychology. And I had learned that development was more or less done when you were about age 18. And my grandmother taught me that there was much, much more. She really was the one who was my anchor, whom I felt so privileged to know because I did know her. So my passion about aging I owe to those grandmothers who set me on a course of thinking about later life. Over the years, that passion has led me to think globally about big issues in aging. And one of the things that Vera mentioned in her introduction was the work that I'm doing around large global issues in aging. We can't know the processes of growing up and growing old, I think, unless we not only talk to one another, but understand how those intersect with political instabilities, with global migrations, with economic recessions, and more we live in that global world, and I think we have to know what's going on. And so this work with the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics is around making those connections and fostering our capacities to do that. It's not easy to work across cultures and across languages and across settings. As Ian can attest, it's not easy to fling your body around through time zones and get off an airplane and pretend you know what continent you're on. So these are difficult skills, and part of our mission and the work with my colleagues here has been around building that capacity and knowledge. Having Africa as part of the international aging discourse has been hugely important to me, to colleagues around the world, because we're beginning to know aging in new ways. So thank you all for that. There are big global agendas going on right now, and one of the ones that is important to us, I think all of us at whatever stage of the life course we work, is the United Nations Global Agenda on Sustainable Development Goals. It was from its basic principle that I took the title of this talk, that no one is to be left behind. Now, that's a rather grand vision. What do we mean about including people? And left behind from what? And some of the really fine work that's going on in Europe, I think, is helping us address that question. This is work being done on social exclusion. So it's kind of the opposite. What keeps people out of being part of their societies? And the work of a group in Europe headed by Dr. Kieran Walsh suggests that there are 5 ways in which people of all ages might be excluded, and hence we need to think about how to include. The first one is exclusion from civic rights. Do older people in particular, have voting rights? Do they and are they welcome to be engaged politically? Are they engaged in civic activities that give them responsibilities? Are they included not just in a real sense, but symbolically as well? Are there visions of older people that we see in our communities? The second one is place. Are older people welcomed and supported in their communities? We use this term aging in place as if it's a good thing. Well, it's not always a good thing, depending on those places. And I'll talk to you very briefly about some work that Isabella Abodaran and colleagues have been doing. Are there services available to people in their places and communities? Services being included in the everyday services that people receive. I remember a few years ago when rural communities in Canada closed most of their banks. Now, the banks weren't just places where you deposited or took out money, but they were the places where people gathered, where they talked to one another, where they found out the news. In fact, my bank in the little town I live in, which is still open, also posts the death notices, which seems a little odd, but I can tell you there's a lot of going back and forth and looking at these happenings in the community. Exclusion from economic resources is a big part of this global agenda, eliminating poverty or reducing poverty, but it also has to do with things like, can you be involved in productive, paid labor force activity? And who is in and who is out of being able to have access to paid work? And how do those things accumulate across the life course? Because people who are excluded when they're young often experience multiple exclusions across their life course. And finally, exclusion or inclusion from social connections. Isolation is a huge issue around the world, particularly for some older people. How do we build and maintain and make new social connections? How are we included? So that's a big agenda. And if we really mean this, and the challenge of these Sustainable Development Goals is that countries will not only sign on as they have, but they will develop plans and they will work towards those with a 2030 timeline. That seems far in the future. It will be upon us quickly. There's a long list of goals. There will not be a test at the end of this lecture, I promise you. But they have to do with people's quality of life. They have to do with the quality of the environment. There are goals around clean water and air and safe settings. And there are goals that are broad ones around inclusive and just societies. And in the brief time that we're together, I want to touch on a small number of them that I think particularly impact older people and are ones that are international in their scope and importance. And I've highlighted them there. They're also very large goals. And they're not, you'll notice they're not written about a particular age group. I'm speaking mostly about older people, but we really do need to think about people across the life course. Hopefully, we're all interconnected. The World Health Organization also has had a major agenda around aging, and about 2 years ago published a large report on global aging. And this was the quote that I think is a really important one, the one that was kind of central to their report. And what they mean in that report is that you have to not only take into account the lives of older people, but the settings in which they live. Because it's the fit, or the ways in which those settings work, that make a difference to people's quality of life. So things like, it's fine to live in a large city if you are mobile and can walk and can manage public transportation and traffic and so on. It's not a good fit for you if you are unwell or you have a disability, because you can't navigate those systems. So just saying we need to have a public transit system and we're fine is not the case. Any of you who've ever navigated the underground in London, UK, will know what I mean. So fit is important. And the outcome we're looking for is well-being. If we can do better. So part of it's about health, but a lot of it is about those settings in which we live. So, World Health Organization talks about the person, their health, their education, their well-being, their mental health, and these environments. Now, what do we mean by environments? We're not just talking about clean air and water. So here are the environments that we're talking about in this global social issues on aging. Place. Where people live matters. It matters because that's where they live their everyday lives. The World Health Organization has had a major initiative around place and making places age-friendly. People, those social relationships, the ability to have others that you can count on who will help you out if you need it. And policy, and that's one we don't talk about enough. I don't mean politics. I mean our values, our beliefs, the ways in which we view people across the life course. Those are big ones because they really set how it is that we're going to think about aging. And these are some of the challenges in each of these settings. I think we have much to do in terms of thinking about whether the places people grow old are the right places. In Canada, it's kind of ironic. We're very mobile people in Canada. We move houses on average about once every 5 years. And yet somehow, when we get to be old, there's an assumption that moving is a bad thing and you need to stay in the same place, and that's a good place to be. Well, maybe. Perhaps choices about where you live would be nice too. And I want to talk to you just for a few minutes at the end of my talk about some projects that have been going on around the world in terms of how communities can be supportive to older people. I'm only going to talk about one thing here because it's a particular agenda of mine. And that is about families. Families around the world are always kind of brought to the top when we think about older people. We have powerful assumptions in every culture about the place of families in the lives of older people. And we must look beyond the assumptions. I grew up in that big extended family. Was that a great place to get to know my grandparents? Actually not. I'm not sure that my grandfather even knew my name. It's just a little example. But we need to be critical about what we think about families, and particularly when we're thinking about families and care. Who's providing the care? Which way is it going up and down generations? Is the care welcome? Can it be offered? So that's one that's on my agenda, and I know on the agenda of people here as well. And finally, policy. I think we have much to do to make explicit our national values in various countries around things like, is it really up to you? Is this an individualistic society? Are you in a society where it's collective and there's a sense that we take care of everybody? Or is it up to you and your family to make sure you're okay? Makes a big difference in how we proceed and what we think. Okay, let me just spend a few minutes talking about a project in which I've been involved, because I think it illustrates context quite nicely. This is a project that I've been working on with the World Health Organization. WHO has a program with low and middle income countries around the world. And the goal is to improve well-being by looking at what's going on at the community level in these very, very different settings. This project is being run by the World Health Organization in Kobe, Japan. And I must say, just at the outset, the project in Kenya is not part of this set of community-based projects, but I think it fits in the sense of some important work that's being done. So, China. Now, China has, I think, something close to 300 million older people. The vastness of their country and their population and challenges are quite immense. They have an aging population, and they are coming to notice the rapidly aging part of their population, in part because have had for 40 years a policy to reduce population growth. And that was a one-child policy. It was a very important policy, but it had an unintended consequence, two unintended consequences. One is that when people could only have one child, boys were preferred over girls. The other, so there you got a bit of an issue, because now you've got these men looking for wives and not finding them. You also have a whole cohort of people who are old and growing older who have only one child who may be living at a distance. So the community-based project that was presented at WHO was one in which there was an attempt to provide support to older people living in quite deprived rural areas who might have a child, but that child perhaps was living at a distance in the city. And we're talking at a distance, perhaps thousands of kilometers distant. There are strict rules in China about being able to take other family members to a city. So often parents, older people were at home, sometimes raising grandchildren. And I think that sounds familiar in many countries. So what the government did was to provide a small amount of money to a number of villages to train community, mostly volunteers, most of them older people, to provide some basic services to older people, including food and some basic health care and so on. What they did was get people better connected and at least help make sure that people were all right and were fed. In contrast, in Iran, also a very structured government, the city of Tehran ran older people's clubs. There were some 60,000 people, older people in Tehran, involved in these clubs. They were free of charge, and they were mostly social. So they did various physical activities, they did social events, they invited young people in and did some generational connection. They say that one of the things this did was make older people feel empowered because they were the ones running these clubs. How many people were isolated and didn't take part? We don't know for sure. In Lebanon, and I wanted to mention this particularly, in Lebanon, the American University of Beirut has a program that really is aimed at a very different group of older people. And these are at least middle-class older people who are relatively well educated, and they were taking university courses at the campus. Great for intergenerational connections. Some controversy on this WHO committee about whether or not that project even belonged in this set of projects. My argument would be no one left behind. And many of those people, even if they had adequate economic resources, were isolated. And so it connected people, and I think something for us to think about. Russia, I found probably the most interesting one personally, I guess because I come from a very cold northern climate. And this project was one done in northern Siberia, well above the Arctic Circle, in a tiny little hamlets scattered around this vast and very harsh landscape. The intervention there was with older people who did not have any family members, who had nobody close by, and they recruited neighbors and paid them a small amount of money to make sure that those people were fed and that there was a fire burning in the house to keep them warm. Very basic services to very isolated people. There is just no chance in a setting like that that you're going to be able to bring in services to those older people. So I think an interesting and important one with real isolation. The thing that struck me about Serbia was that it's a country that's had incredible political turmoil over many years. I was in Belgrade a few years ago and I met a man who said that his parents had been citizens of 3 different countries and had never moved house. So tremendous turmoil. Serbia is a country that's been quite isolated because of the ways in which it's viewed. In this case, there were self-help groups organized for older people to try to keep them connected, reduce isolation, and deal with trauma that has come from some of the political history in that country. They felt like those connections had really made some meaningful differences in the mental health of the older people who were involved. And I want to finish with talking just very briefly, and I didn't even warn Isabella that I was going to talk about this project. Isabella Abodaran, a colleague at WHO in Kobe and a colleague at APHRC in Nairobi, have written an article that they call age-friendly slums. Now, I'm not sure whether that's meant to be kind of a paradoxical term, because one would expect that age-friendly and slums don't go together. And what they did in this project, and Isabella, I'm sure, in the reception can tell you much more about it, it's her project. But what they did was take the indicators that the WHO had developed around age-friendly communities, which have been taken around the world and used, and take a critical look at how well they worked and whether they were the right ones. And that's exactly the kind of work we need to be doing. We can't just take an off-the-shelf, aging in place, age-friendly communities, supportive families idea and plop it in somewhere else and say, well, we can just use it there. We've got to be critical. And in their work, they were particularly critical about issues like very degraded physical settings, like families in which there was tension and sometimes violence, like issues of physical and mental health that simply weren't well addressed. There needs to be some recalibration of some of these assumptions and ideas in different settings. I would argue as well that we need to think about calibrating our ideas of aging as people grow older. If we think about age 60 as the entry into old age, and we think that some people will live to be 100 years old or older, and certainly in Japan there are many of those, we're talking about 2 generations of people. So please, let's not talk about those old people or the elderly. One of the nice things about aging is as people grow older, they get to be more diverse. Or as one of my professors once said, as we grow older, we get to be more so. More conservative, more liberal, more stubborn, more whatever. Stubborn just comes to mind because of Dad. Here's a picture that was taken, and some of the people present here are in that photograph of a master class on families and aging that we did last December in Nairobi. It was a great group of people and very wonderful discussions, and I think some of those relationships are continuing. How do we do this? How do we do this sustainable development goal to promote inclusive and just societies? There's no assumption about it being an easy go. But I would suggest that it may begin with grandmothers, but it needs to include those of all generations. And that we need to take seriously this challenge of leaving no one behind. Thank you all. I'll look forward to our conversations after the session is over, and I will turn things over to you, Isabella.